All right, buckle up because this story isn't starting with pleasantries. Imagine this, a quiet night, crickets chirping, the kind of stillness that usually brings peace. But for Elias in his beautiful, sprawling old house on Primrose Lane, the silence was just a thin veil over a growing dread. He stood by his window, a silhouette against the warm glow of the lamp behind him, his gaze fixed on the street. Nothing moved. No cars, no shadows. Just the unwavering, unsettling feeling that something was coming for him and for his home. Elias wasn't a man who sought trouble, he sought solace. His house, a magnificent relic from a bygone era with its intricate woodwork and sprawling garden, was his sanctuary. It stood proudly, a testament to history, amidst a sea of newer, uniform homes, the kind that all looked like they were built from the same blueprint. And that right there was the problem. Because this wasn't just any neighborhood anymore. This was Primrose Estates, ruled with an iron fist by an HOA and specifically by its new president, Mrs. Gable. She had a vision, you see, a pristine, perfectly homogenized vision where every blade of grass was identical, every mailbox matched, and character was considered non-compliant. And Elias' house, it was practically a monument to non-compliance. It had started subtly. The first letter arrived months ago, tucked innocently among junk mail. "Dear resident," it began, "the Primrose Estates HOA is dedicated to maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our esteemed community." Blah, blah, blah. Elias, a man of routine, a man of peace, chuckled and tossed it. He'd seen HOAs come and go. They were like gnats, annoying but ultimately harmless if you swatted them away. But these weren't gnats. They were wasps, and they were building a nest right outside his door. The letters kept coming, each one a little less polite, a little more demanding. Urgent action required, exterior paint scheme review. Notice of violation, landscaping maintenance. They talked about approved palettes and uniform appearance. Elias' grand old house, with its faded, charming blue trim and riotous, vibrant garden, didn't fit any palette, any uniform. It was unique. And uniqueness, it seemed, was now a punishable offense. He ignored them, of course. He paid his monthly dues because he had to, but he drew a line at letting them dictate the very soul of his home. This wasn't just paint, this was his life. This was the house where he'd raised his son, where memories clung to every creaking floorboard. He wasn't going to strip it of its identity just to satisfy some suburban dictator's ego. But here's where the chills really started to set in. The letters stopped being about suggestions. They turned into threats, specific threats. Failure to comply will result in substantial fines. And then a line that made Elias' blood run cold. Your property significantly detracts from the aesthetic value of Primrose Estates and is under active review for severe non-compliance. Further inaction will lead to escalation. Escalation. The word hung in the air, heavy and dark, just like the evening sky outside his window. It wasn't just about money anymore. It felt personal, like they wanted more than just a fresh coat of paint. They wanted control, complete control, and the way they emphasized escalation, the subtle shift from corporate politeness to something far more menacing, made him wonder just how far Mrs. Gable and her HOA were willing to go to get what they wanted. He felt like a target, isolated in the crosshairs of a relentless, unseen enemy. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was only the beginning. What kind of escalation were they planning? And how much peace would he have left before his sanctuary became a battleground? The flimsy paperwork was over. The polite threats were gone. This time, the new, thick envelope that landed in Elias' mailbox wasn't just a fine. It was a gauntlet thrown down. Elias opened it to find a notice of immediate escalation, demanding full compliance with $5,000 in immediate non-negotiable fees for aesthetic damage and failure to mitigate hazards. It was a blatant attempt at financial strangulation. He didn't have time to process the shock before his doorbell rang, not the gentle chime, but a rapid, demanding sequence of jabs. Elias opened the door to find the scene herself, Mrs. Gable, standing on his porch. She wasn't just observing from across the street this time. She was right there, blocking the sunlight, radiating cold authority in a perfectly tailored dark suit. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she said, using her old, predatory name for the first time, a subtle but terrifying slip that Elias instantly noted. She quickly corrected herself. "Mr. Elias, I see you've received our official notice. I took the liberty of delivering it personally to ensure there were no misunderstandings." Elias' fear instantly crystallized into fury. He gripped the doorframe, his voice tight and low. "There are no misunderstandings, Mrs. Gable. I understand that you are running a predatory scheme and using this HOA to try and steal my home." Her sneer was immediate and sharp. "Steal your home? Please, Mr. Elias. We are attempting to preserve the character and value of this community, something your derelict house actively undermines. Look at this facade." She swept her hand dismissively toward his beautiful, weathered front porch. "It's an eyesore." This isn't a museum. It's a modern community, and your stubbornness is costing every single resident thousands in lost equity. My stubbornness? Elias retorted, stepping onto the porch, refusing to be towered over. You have driven people out of Rosewood Heights, demolished their homes for profit, and you think I don't know your game? You're not a concerned citizen. You're a real estate vulture. Mrs. Gable's face didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed, revealing the pure hostility underneath her corporate veneer. She had been hoping to intimidate him. Instead, he had called her out. Your conspiracy theories are pathetic, sir, but they won't stop the inevitable. You have exactly 7 days to submit payment and an approved architectural plan for the total renovation of this property. Failure to do so will result in us retaining contractors to execute the changes ourselves, and you will be billed tenfold. She stepped closer, invading his space, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. I suggest you get used to the idea of moving, Elias. This house is a relic, and relics eventually get paved over. She didn't wait for a response, spinning on her heel and marching back to her pristine black SUV, leaving Elias trembling on his porch, the echo of her threat hanging in the air. The sheer audacity of her visit, the direct confrontation, and the use of the contractor's threat, which was thinly veiled forced entry, snapped something inside Elias. He was no longer just a victim, he was an adversary. He looked at the fines, then at the street, and knew he couldn't fight this alone. He had to get official help. He had to show them the intimidation was crossing the line from civil to criminal. He retreated inside, his mind racing. He knew the police wouldn't care about the fines, but they had to care about threats, surveillance, and talk of forced entry. He decided to call the non-emergency line, believing that some official record of the scene's behavior would be his shield. But that was a naive hope. He was about to learn that when the law views something as a civil matter, you are truly on your own. The scene had weaponized the system itself, and the next step he took would only deepen his despair. The worst of the loneliness was yet to come. The morning after Mrs. Gable's chilling, face-to-face threat, the atmosphere around Elias' house turned palpably colder. The scene wasn't just finding him now, they were stalking him. Elias tried to maintain his routine, tending his garden in the early morning light, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. He'd catch glimpses of movement, a slight shift in the blinds of the house across the street, a momentary glint of glass from behind a massive hedge. Every time he looked, the source vanished, leaving him with a gnawing sense of instability. He found small, unsettling things, a piece of trash left conspicuously on his pristine porch, a carefully placed stone in his driveway that he knew wasn't there before. These were not random acts. They were calculated psychological strikes designed to break his will and let him know they were close, always watching. The loneliness became overwhelming. He was isolated, financially threatened, and now personally intimidated. He knew he couldn't just stand there and be stalked. He had to appeal to a real authority. He picked up the phone and dialed the non-emergency police line. He spoke to a dispatcher, a young woman whose voice sounded patient but completely detached. Elias carefully laid out his entire ordeal, starting with the excessive, targeted fines for aesthetic noncompliance, then moving to the constant surveillance, the trespassing, and culminating in the direct verbal threat from Mrs. Gable about sending contractors to force entry. And you say the Homeowners Association president personally threatened forced entry? The dispatcher asked. Yes, Elias said, his voice pleading. She said they would hire people to execute the changes, which is a veiled threat to trespass and vandalize my property, and they're watching me. I have pictures of their surveillance cars parked down the street. He waited, holding his breath, hoping for the reassuring weight of the law to fall on his side. He waited for them to say they would send an officer, take a report, and warn Mrs. Gable. Instead, the response was a polite but utterly crushing dismissal. Sir, I understand your concern, but the issue of fines and aesthetic noncompliance is strictly a civil matter, falling under the jurisdiction of your Homeowners Association covenants, the dispatcher calmly explained. Threats regarding contractual work, even if aggressive, are also civil in nature. Unless you have proof of a physical break-in or immediate violent criminal threat, there is very little we can do. This is a neighbor dispute, and we advise you to contact an attorney. The phone felt heavy in Elias' hand. He tried to argue, but what about the surveillance, the intimidation? That's harassment. Sir, she replied, her patience wearing thin, in a public community, people are legally allowed to observe their neighbors. Unless they are directly physically threatening you or trespassing on your private land, there is no criminal offense. Please seek civil counsel. Click. The line went dead. Elias slowly placed the phone back on the cradle. He sank into his kitchen chair, a hollow feeling settling in his chest. He had reached out for help, and the entire system, the local police, the civil courts, had closed the door on him. He was truly and utterly alone. Mrs. Gable hadn't just weaponized the HOA, she had weaponized the rules of society against him. The scene had won this round. They knew the police wouldn't intervene. They had official confirmation that they could continue their intimidation campaign right up to the very threshold of a crime without consequence. Elias was defenseless. That afternoon, he received another notice, not a fine, but a date and time. Inspection scheduled, 48 hours. He looked at the notice, then out the window at the quiet, watching street. He knew this wasn't an inspection. It was the forced entry he'd been warned about. He was out of options, out of time, and out of hope. The scene was closing in for the kill. He had 2 days before his home became a crime scene itself. If only there was anyone who could see past the civil matter facade and understand the real danger he was in. The paranoia, the constant feeling of being watched, had turned Elias' peaceful home into a fortress of anxiety. He found himself jumping at shadows. Every car that slowed on his street became a potential threat, and the simple act of checking his mail felt like a high-stakes mission. The fines were still a problem, but they had become secondary to the psychological war Mrs. Gable was waging. He was alone, and he was losing. But here's the thing about a quiet life spent reading and observing: it teaches you patience, and it teaches you to notice things others miss. Elias, fueled by a new, cold anger, decided he was done being the hunted. He was going to start hunting for answers. He started with the name that signed every threatening letter, Mrs. Gable. She was the face of the HOA, the self-proclaimed savior of the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. But who was she really? Elias didn't use social media, didn't have a digital footprint to speak of, but he knew how to use the internet. He spent the next few days in his study, the glow of his old computer screen a beacon in the dark. He wasn't looking for gossip, he was looking for a pattern. His search started slow, sifting through public records and local news archives. He found articles about her being elected to the HOA board, her glowing quotes about modernization, and her background as a successful real estate agent. It all seemed perfectly normal. Too normal, in fact. Then he got a hit. A small, buried article from a lesser-known online community forum for local historical societies. The headline was unassuming: "Historic homes in Rosewood Heights face demolition." Rosewood Heights was a neighborhood on the other side of town, but the name caught his eye. He clicked, and what he read made the hair on his arms stand up. The article detailed a similar HOA takeover in Rosewood Heights 5 years prior. The story was almost a carbon copy of his own. A new, aggressive HOA board had been elected, led by a ruthless president who pushed a modernization agenda. The focus of their campaign? The beautiful, historic houses that gave the neighborhood its character. The HOA had used the same tactics: aggressive fines for aesthetic noncompliance, public shaming, and relentless surveillance. But here's the kicker: the president of that Rosewood Heights HOA wasn't Mrs. Gable. It was a woman named Eleanor Vance. Elias had never heard the name before, but a quick search for her turned up something incredible. An old business profile, a professional headshot. It was Mrs. Gable. Same piercing eyes, same perfectly coiffed hair. She had used a different last name. A maiden name, maybe? It didn't matter, it was the same person. Elias' hands, which had been steady for days, suddenly started shaking. It wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just about his house. This was a playbook, a meticulously planned, long-term strategy. The article went on to explain the aftermath in Rosewood Heights. The old homeowners, unable to fight the crippling fines and psychological pressure, had been forced to sell their homes. And who had bought them? A holding company, a shell corporation, that then promptly demolished the historic houses and built new, uniform ones in their place. A company that, according to the article, was linked back to a real estate firm. The same real estate firm where a woman named Eleanor Vance was listed as a high-ranking partner. Elias clicked through to the real estate firm's website. There, under the leadership section, was Mrs. Gable in her full professional glory. He had been so focused on the HOA aspect, on the bureaucratic harassment, that he hadn't seen the real game being played. The fines, the surveillance, the public shaming, it was all designed to devalue his property, to break his will and force a sale. And when he eventually caved, someone would swoop in and buy his house for a fraction of its worth. Someone like Mrs. Gable, through a shell company, of course. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about pure predatory greed. She wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a corporate shark, using her position to bully people out of their homes so she could profit from their demolition. Elias wasn't just a homeowner with a non-compliant house. He was the final obstacle in a grand, calculated scheme. He leaned back in his chair, the screen still glowing with the evidence of her past crimes. He was no longer a victim. The fear was still there, but it was now laced with a steely resolve. He had proof of her motive. He had a weapon. Now he just had to figure out how to use it, but just as he was about to print the articles, a loud, insistent knock echoed through the quiet house. A sudden, sharp sound that made him jump. He hadn't heard a car pull up. It was late. Who would be at his door at this hour? The knock came again, this time more demanding. Elias felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Had they seen his search history? Did they know what he had found? He crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction. There was no car outside, just a lone figure cloaked in the darkness of his porch, its hand raised to knock again. He didn't recognize the person, but he felt with a terrible certainty that they knew him, and they knew he was home. The insistent knock at the door, right after Elias' shocking discovery, had rattled him to his core. He'd pressed himself against the wall beside the front door, heart hammering, trying to peer through the peephole. Nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty porch. After a minute of agonizing silence, he'd slowly, cautiously opened the door just a crack. Empty. Had it been his imagination, or had Mrs. Gable's goons merely been testing his resolve, seeing if he was home, making sure he knew they were always watching? He didn't know, but the incident solidified his resolve. He wasn't just dealing with a pushy HOA, he was dealing with a calculated predator. He printed every article, every forum post, every piece of evidence linking Mrs. Gable, or Alina Vance, whatever her real name was, to her previous schemes. He organized them into a neat, incriminating pile, but who could he trust with this? He was a recluse. His circle was small, almost non-existent. The police. They'd probably dismiss it as a neighborhood dispute until there was actual proof of a crime. He needed someone who understood the law, someone who knew how to fight. And then, like a plot twist in a forgotten novel, a lifeline appeared. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Elias heard a car pull into his driveway. He braced himself, expecting another delivery of HOA threats, or perhaps even one of Mrs. Gable's shadowy observers. But when he peeked through the curtains, a familiar, albeit older face was emerging from a sleek black sedan. "Dad!" Elias' jaw dropped. It was his son, Alex. Alex, who lived 3 states away, a police detective in a busy metropolitan precinct. Alex, who hadn't visited in person in over a year, usually opting for phone calls or video chats. He stood on the porch, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, a concerned frown already creasing his brow. "Alex, what on earth are you doing?" Elias managed, rushing to open the door, a wave of relief washing over him so strong it almost buckled his knees. Alex gave a tired smile, but his eyes were sharp, immediately taking in the unkempt garden, the non-compliance sign, and his father's visibly strained demeanor. "Surprise visit, Dad. Got a few days off, figured I'd finally swing by, though looks like I picked an interesting time." His gaze lingered on the stark HOA sign, then swept over the weary lines around Elias' eyes. Elias tried to play it down. "Just some neighborhood silliness, son. Nothing to worry about." He led Alex inside, trying to steer him away from the piles of unopened HOA letters on the kitchen counter. But Alex, being a detective, was trained to see what wasn't being said. He noticed the darkened windows, the way his father flinched at sudden noises, the jumpiness in his eyes. He saw the carefully organized stack of documents on the study desk, peeking out from under a newspaper. And he definitely noticed the aggressive, official-looking mail that somehow made its way onto the counter even after Elias' best efforts to hide it. That evening, over a dinner of Elias' famously bland meatloaf, Alex finally pressed him. "Dad, what's going on? You're not yourself. And what's with that sign out front?" Elias hesitated, then a dam broke. All the fear, the frustration, the crushing weight of isolation came pouring out. He explained everything: the letters, the fines, the surveillance, the chilling discovery about Mrs. Gable's past. He pulled out the stack of printed articles, the evidence of her previous schemes, the proof of her identity as Alina Vance. Alex listened, his expression growing darker with each detail. He picked up one of the final notice letters, his thumb tracing Mrs. Gable's ornate signature. "So this isn't just about painting your house, is it, Dad? This woman is running a racket. This is premeditated harassment, potentially even fraud and attempted extortion." Elias nodded, feeling a powerful surge of hope for the first time in months. "She wants this house, Alex. She wants to tear it down and put up another one of her beige boxes." Alex stood up, pacing the study, his detective instincts fully engaged. "She's good, using the HOA as a front, leveraging bureaucratic power to devalue properties and force sales, and she's done this before." He looked at the collected evidence, a grim admiration in his eyes. "You did good, Dad. This is solid." Suddenly, the weight lifted from Elias' shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone who understood, someone who could fight. Alex, a trained police officer, was not only capable but also deeply invested. This wasn't just a random case. It was his father's home, his family's history under attack. "We need to be smart about this," Alex said, his voice firm and decisive. "She's not just a real estate agent. She's a predator, and predators get cornered." He spent the rest of the night poring over the documents, making calls to his contacts, tapping into his own network. The quiet house, once a haven for Elia's solitude, now buzzed with a different kind of energy, the focused, determined energy of a detective on the trail of a suspect. The next morning, as Elias slowly walked through his garden, he still felt the tension, the lingering paranoia. But this time, it was different. He wasn't a lone sentinel anymore. He had backup, and he knew that Mrs. Gable in her arrogance had just made her biggest mistake. She had sent her hounds to threaten a quiet old man, but what she didn't know was that the quiet old man's son was a very real, very dangerous wolf. The game had just changed, and Mrs. Gable was about to find out exactly what happens when you poke a sleeping bear, especially when that bear has a detective for a son. And Alex had a hunch that Mrs. Gable's escalation was far from over. He just had to wait for her next move because he knew with chilling certainty that she wouldn't be able to resist one final, desperate push. Okay, here we go with the next part. The tension is building, and Alex is now fully in the game. The house, for the first time in months, felt like a sanctuary again, albeit one on high alert. With Alex there, the suffocating paranoia that had plagued Elias began to recede, replaced by a sense of guarded anticipation. Alex had turned the study into a temporary command center, his laptop open, his phone constantly at his ear, weaving a complex web of contacts and legal research. He was building a case, not just for his father, but against Mrs. Gable's entire predatory operation. "She's backed into a corner, Dad," Alex had explained late one night, poring over blueprints of Elias' house. "The fines aren't working quickly enough, and she knows we're onto her. She's going to try something big, something direct. She needs to force your hand before we can expose her." Elias nodded, a knot of unease still tightening in his stomach. He trusted Alex, but the thought of a direct confrontation with Mrs. Gable's ruthless tactics was terrifying. He'd always avoided conflict, always preferred peace. Days passed in a tense quiet. Alex had advised Elias to keep a low profile, to answer no more letters, and certainly not to open the door to anyone he didn't recognize. "We let her make the next move," Alex had said, his eyes hard. "And when she does, we'll be ready." Then came the morning. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, innocent blue, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break. Elias was in the kitchen making his tea when he heard it, a sharp, authoritative rapping at the front door. Not the subtle, testing knocks from before, but a loud, official series of thuds that seemed to vibrate through the old house. His heart leaped into his throat. He glanced at Alex, who was already on his feet, his detective's posture instantly alert. Alex gave him a look. "Stay calm." "Stay here, Dad," Alex murmured, his voice low, almost a growl. He moved silently, smoothly towards the front door. He didn't approach it directly, but stopped just short, listening. The knocking came again, even louder. "Code enforcement, open up, we have a warrant for immediate inspection," a gruff voice boomed from the other side. "Failure to comply will result in forced entry." Elias' blood ran cold. "Warrant," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They can't have a warrant." Alex held up a hand, silencing him. He moved closer to the door, his hand resting on the lock. He knew this was it. This was Mrs. Gable's escalation. He took a deep breath, and with a decisive click, he opened the door. Standing on the porch were two men. They wore dark blue uniforms, complete with utility belts, clipboards, and what looked like official-looking badges pinned to their chests. They had the stern, no-nonsense demeanor of authority figures. One was a burly man with a shaved head, the other taller, lankier, with a patchy beard. "Code enforcement," the burly one repeated, his eyes immediately assessing the entryway, trying to push past Alex. "We have a warrant for immediate safety inspection of this property. It has been deemed a public hazard." He held up a folded piece of paper, too quickly for Elias to read, but it looked official enough at a glance. But Alex wasn't Elias. Alex was a detective. And he saw through the facade in an instant. The badges. They were too shiny, almost like cheap replicas, and the lettering was slightly off. The uniforms, while dark, were ill-fitting, bunching in odd places, not the crisp, tailored look of genuine law enforcement. And the term public hazard for an old house that had stood for a century with no structural issues. It was a laughable pretext. "Warrant, huh?" Alex said, his voice dangerously calm, his eyes scanning every detail, every twitch of their faces. He didn't move from the doorway, blocking their path completely. The lanky man took a step forward, trying to appear more imposing. "Yes, son, and if you don't step aside, we'll be forced to consider that obstruction of justice." "Obstruction of what?" Alex scoffed, a faint, humorless smile playing on his lips. "Let me see that warrant." He reached out not for the paper, but for the badge on the burly man's chest. Before the man could react, Alex had deftly unclipped it, examining it closely. "This is remarkably poor craftsmanship," Alex mused, turning the fake badge over in his hand. "And the seal, that's definitely not the county seal. In fact," he added, his voice hardening, I don't recognize the jurisdiction this code enforcement agency supposedly operates under. Funny that, because I do happen to be a police detective for the Metropolitan District. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that you two are not real code enforcement officers." The color drained from the faces of the two men. Their bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by wide-eyed panic. They exchanged a terrified glance. "Now," Alex continued, stepping fully onto the porch, towering over them, his hand instinctively going to the concealed weapon at his hip, "I'm going to give you two choices. You can either wait right here for the real sheriff's deputies I'm about to call and explain to them why you're impersonating public officials and attempting to illegally enter a private residence under false pretenses." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you can tell me who sent you, and then perhaps you can make a run for it before my colleagues arrive." Just then, from across the street, a woman emerged from behind a row of neatly trimmed hedges, her face etched with a look of smug expectation. It was Mrs. Gable, of course. She had been observing, waiting for her grand triumph. But as she saw the two inspectors suddenly turn pale and Alex standing there, a genuine badge clipped to his belt, her triumphant smirk slowly morphed into a mask of pure horror. "This is Mrs. Gable, isn't it?" Alex asked, without even looking at her, his voice a cold blade. "Looks like you have some explaining to do, both of you." He pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and in a clear, commanding voice stated, "This is Detective Alex Miller, badge number. I have two individuals here impersonating code enforcement officers, attempting an illegal entry into a private residence. And I believe I've also identified the orchestrator of this little scheme." The two fake inspectors, seeing their escape route blocked by a real detective and knowing the jig was up, looked like deer caught in headlights. Mrs. Gable, across the street, turned on her heel and began to walk away, a desperate, almost comical attempt to disappear into the perfectly manicured landscape she so adored. But it was too late. The cavalry was coming and the showdown had officially begun. Elias, watching from the doorway, felt a rush of adrenaline, a profound mix of fear and exhilarating vindication. The hunter had become the hunted, and it was glorious. The sudden silence was almost as deafening as the sirens had been. Elias watched from his porch as the two deputies, with a professional efficiency that felt like a powerful benediction, led Mrs. Gable and her two flunkies to their squad cars. Mrs. Gable, even in handcuffs, carried herself with a furious dignity. She didn't look back at Elias. She didn't have to. The venom in her eyes as they dragged her past his house was more than enough. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, the kind of look that said, "You might have won this battle, but the war is far from over." As the squad cars pulled away, the flashing red and blue lights casting an eerie glow on the manicured lawns, Elias felt the weight of the last few months finally lift from his shoulders. He was still trembling, but not from fear. It was from a deep, profound sense of vindication. The nightmare was over. The neighbors, who had previously avoided all eye contact and kept their curtains drawn, now spilled out onto their driveways. They didn't come to talk to Elias, not yet. They stood in small, hushed groups, pointing at the spot where the police cars had been, a shocked and gossiping air hanging over the street. The illusion of Primrose Estates as a pristine, problem-free paradise had been shattered. It was a victory not just for Elias, but for the soul of the community itself. Alex, ever the professional, was already on his phone, his voice a low, steady rumble as he spoke to contacts in the district attorney's office. "Yeah, we've got the impersonation, attempted forced entry, and a mountain of evidence on the harassment front. The pattern of behavior in Rosewood Heights, I'll have all the documentation emailed to you within the hour." He hung up, a grim satisfaction on his face. "It's a slam dunk, Dad. They have her on so many charges, she won't be seeing the outside of a courtroom for a very long time. This was more than just a power play, it was a clear-cut criminal enterprise." Elias could finally breathe. He looked out at his front yard, at the wild, untamed beauty of his garden that had started this entire ordeal. It had been his sanctuary, his quiet rebellion, and for a terrifying period, a target. He walked over to the black and white HOA sign, the one that had publicly shamed him for so long. The sign read, "Property under review for and when compliance." He grabbed it by the base and pulled. The wooden stake was stubborn, resisting him for a moment before snapping free with a satisfying crack. He tossed it onto the curb with a triumphant thud. Later that evening, as the last rays of sun dipped below the horizon, Elias and Alex sat on the porch swing. It was the first time in a long time that Elias felt like he could simply be in his own home. He told Alex how he'd felt, how the constant surveillance and the fines had made him feel like he was losing his mind. Alex listened, not with the detached air of a detective, but with the warm concern of a son. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner, Dad," Alex said, his voice soft. You came exactly when I needed you, Elias replied, a lump forming in his throat. I couldn't have done this without you. Their bond, once a distant comfort of phone calls and holiday visits, had been forged in the fire of this fight. Elias had shown his son a quiet strength, an unyielding defiance, and Alex had shown his father that even in solitude, you're never truly alone. The story of the house on Primrose Lane became a local legend. Reporters came, eager to tell the tale of the quiet man who stood up to a corrupt HOA and won. The neighborhood's board was dismantled, its power stripped, and a new wave of community leaders vowed to be more transparent and fair. Elias' house was no longer just a landmark. It was a symbol of resistance, a monument to the idea that some things, like your home, your character, your right to be different, are worth fighting for. For a while, things were quiet. Peace returned to Elias' life. But then, months later, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It had no return address. The envelope was thick, the paper inside crisp and expensive. He opened it, his heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a bill or a fine, it was just a single sheet of paper. No signature, just a short, cryptic note written in that same, neat, confident script he recognized from Mrs. Gable's letters. This isn't over, you'll see. He stared at the note, a chill running down his spine. The threats weren't coming from the HOA anymore. They were coming from her personally. Even in prison, her malice was reaching out, a final, chilling whisper that promised she hadn't forgotten and she hadn't given up. Elias walked to his fireplace, held the note over a small flame until it curled and blackened, and let it drop into the embers. He would never live in perfect peace again. The victory had come with a lingering shadow. But as he watched the paper turn to ash, he smiled. He might have to always be on his guard, but he had something she could never take: his home, his dignity, and a family that would always have his back.